That's the late minister in the presidency, Jackson Mthembu, who is also going to be remembered as someone who pioneered the often complex political and government communication space. As the ANC spokesperson, he was often the trigger of major communication messages that ended up in various government communication nerve centers. Mthembu's ability was also visible in how he balanced the communicating difficult political positions and later official government positions. We are now going to bring you a panel looking at how he shaped communications and championed media transformation. And joining me in studio is our politics editor, Sbu Ngalwa, the media specialist and former government communicator herself, Troy Martens. And we're also joined virtually by Nkenke Kekana. He is the head of the ANC subcommittee on communications. And then we're joined by Eyewitness News editor-in-chief, Mahlase. Thank you all for making time to join us here in studio. I'm going to start with our very own. I'm sorry, it's got to be a biased one. Sbu Ngalwa, describe the relationship that you would say Jackson Mthembu had with the media.
I think everyone appreciates and acknowledges that Jackson was actually was open, and he actually was always jovial, and he was a funny character. But I think more than anything, and the theme that keeps coming through in all the conversations that we're hearing, is that Jackson was a good stand-up guy. You know, he was honest, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, and I was making an example yesterday, Xoli, and I think it's important today as we're discussing at Jackson as to how communications, how the ANC communicated under his leadership. And I made an example about you, actually, how I used to mock you. When you worked for your previous employer, as when we were still politics reporters on the field, and at that time I was still working for a newspaper, and how I used to mock TV journalists for having to camp outside SLN Park in Kempton Park, where the ANC used to have its NEC meetings. You actually could not access the place. You know, we had to stand outside, and then a motorcade of black cars would pass by, and you had to speculate whether it's the president or it's the deputy. No, it's the president, because we see an ambulance. No, it's not. So that was the nature of how we had to. It was at a distance. I mean, the party communicated. But when after 2007, ironically, also at a time when we had what I would say a problematic presidency of Jacob Zuma. That's where the ANC actually opened up. We could get into the venue of the ANC. We could walk into the actual room where the NEC is meeting for a doorstop where we have impromptu interviews and also take pictures of the leaders. But the reality was that in all, given even the difficulty of communicating for that kind of a leadership or administration, he still understood the need for the ANC to be seen, to be transparent, even under those difficult circumstances.
Indeed, and I couldn't have said it better, Sbu. Let me ask you, Mahlase, your characterization of Jackson Mthembu's relationship with the media. How would you describe it?
Very open, very frank, very honest. And I have to also add to what Sbu was saying about being very jovial. You know, Jackson Mthembu was this one person where we could be in a heated debate about a story, the way the media was covering it, but you always knew that it was never personal. He understood the role of the media. He understood our right and our space to be critical of the governing party, but he also approached us when he disagreed with our coverage and actually took us to task. But it was all a friendly debate and a friendly conversation, and actually very, very frank. I'm also just remembering, you know, Jackson Mthembu in, I think it was at Mangaung, and those late nights that we used to have, and how he would be there to try and help us get the stories that we are looking for, understanding that, you know, it's a difficult thing that we are covering, where the ANC is trying to keep us out, but we are also looking 4 stories, and he would try his best to actually accommodate and give us access where possible and ensure that there is communication coming out of those conferences. I just was remembering, or I was reminded by a journalist as he used to shout out during those press conferences, and he would go and pronounce my name, you know, the way Nguni people call Mahlatse, or actually Gallants, as he used to shout out. But it was actually quite a good thing. But I think one of the things that I have learned to appreciate in the past 24 hours is just how human he actually was. You know, He never carried airs about the position that he held. He understood that he must be accessible. We must call him at any given time, and he must actually answer. And it becomes even more important at a struggling with a lot of spokespeople who just think sending a voice note, repeating what's written in the press statement is enough, where they're always protecting their principles and don't see the relationship with the media as part of accountability. You know, it's those things that really stand out, especially at this time.
Yeah. Before I come back to studio, to Troy Martens, Mr. Kekana, I want to come to you briefly. And how would you describe Jackson Mthembu as a communicator? What is that legacy in your mind that he leaves behind?
You know, I must say that I'm devastated. The news of Jackson, they are still sinking in. It is somebody that will really miss in the ANC. It is somebody who will miss in government. He was a frontliner. He was an honest, transparent communicator. He kept everybody honest in government. You will not lie about something else that that comes. He's not going to allow you to do that. So he was that honest professional. He was a communicator of note. He had the right voice, that baritone voice. I used to call it a radio voice. He was an honest and professional communicator of the ANC.
Yeah.
We will miss him. He's the enemy. The coronavirus enemy has really struck at the heart of our defense, and we need to really find a way of communicating in a very, very simple way the message of hope for our people, because we have to defeat this enemy.
Yeah. Troy Martens, before we go for a short breather, you were at Luthuli House at some point, and then you were also in government. People will remember you well as the spokesperson for the Minister of Basic Education, Nkenke Motshekga. What would you say were the things that you learnt from Jackson Mthembu?
Yes, so thanks, Nolly. I think I must say, first off, I'm also devastated. I think everyone who's worked closely with Jackson Mthembu would know that he was a good man, and like Sbu mentioned, an upstanding human being. Yeah. And I think from an ANC communications perspective, he really understood what the media needed. He understood that in order to be able to communicate effectively, you need to actually be accessible. You need to provide the media with what they need to be able to do the stories that need to be written and to communicate what you want to get out there to people. I remember Mahlatse mentioned the Mangaung conference. We were there in 2012. You were there. I was there in my role as an ANC communicator, and we ran around all hours of the night and day to get media what they needed, to go and find NEC members that they needed to speak to on certain topics. And that was because Comrade Jackson understood that in order he understood how the media worked, he understood what they needed, he understood that he needed to create an enabling environment for the media to be able to do the work that they needed to do. And I think he was an advocate of a free media, even within the ranks of the ruling party, of the ANC. He often had to explain the role of the media and why the media does certain things or has to do certain things.
Yeah.
There are political principals who don't necessarily want to speak to the media because they don't trust the media in certain instances. And he was that person always pushing, saying, no, you need to be there, you need to speak to the media. So,
Troy
yeah.
Martens, we are going to continue this conversation. I can't wait to hear all of you and your reflections of Jackson Mthembu, because also he was a human being. He had his own personal struggles, and we're going to touch on those in a bit. Let's take a break, and we're going to continue this conversation in a moment. This is Newsfeed, the Friday edition.
I've interacted with Minister Jackson Mthembu for the better part of a decade as ANC spokesperson, as chief whip of the ANC, and then later on as minister. He was always jovial, he always laughed with journalists, he always understood the role of the media and the important work that we do. He always accommodated us and the respect that he had for everyone, whether it was for ministers, for journalists, for his peers, for those that worked for him. He will always be remembered for his humility.
The one thing about Jackson Mthembu that's very clear is that he had this thing about people, he had this love for people, he had this way of engaging with people, this generosity of spirit that I even remember from my own Cub days as a journalist. I met him during the era of don't buy, City Press, don't buy. And though it was serious, though there were moments that were really heated, and there were questions really about freedom of the press, freedom of expression, about what democratic principles actually mean, there were really lots of moments of laughter and humor. And that's kind of how he's been ever since I've known Jackson Mthembu. He's also had this really wonderful generosity, again, of spirit, where even though he doesn't really know you, he doesn't know very much about you, he makes you feel like you are important in that particular point, at that particular point in time. So it's those kind of values, that kind of approach to people that will always stand out. And I think it's also how he understood particular tasks when given to him. I recall moments where he was deployed to Parliament and how seriously he took that job and how seriously he was committed to wanting to play that role to the best of his abilities in order to serve South Africans. A lot of the conversations that have been happening has been about how loyal he's been to both his party, the ANC, and to the country. And I think that's what we got a sense of. And he steered us. He really steered us in terms of communications.
Reflections from journalists about their relationship with Jackson Mthembu, and indeed, I think by extension, the ANC's relationship, in particular, the head of communications in the governing party with the media. Mr. Kekana, I want to come to you very briefly and ask you your sense of the ANC's relationship with the media. You heard Tsidimadia there talking about don't buy, City Press, don't buy. And we will remember at that time very well as to why he decided to say that. And if my memory serves me well, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, but it had to do with a particular image that was shown of the former president Jacob Zuma with the spear. It was called the spear, the painting, in fact. And City Press decided that they were going to have that on their newspaper at the time. And this angered the governing party. I remember the enraged Blade Nzimande, the SACP leader. But Mr. Kekana, talk to us about whether or not the ANC and the ANC have had a troublesome relationship and how you would characterize that. I mean, I can't stop but think of the so-called media tribunal.
The Comrade Jackson, as we remember him today, you have said all the positive things about him, how he kept everybody honest and how he was transparent, how he was joyful. And that is really a good summary of what he stood for in the ANC in government. The ANC's relationship with the media, you know, there is necessary tension. We need a media that is robust, that is able to keep us in check in the interest of the public. We need a media that is able to ask the difficult questions. And Comrade Jackson was not shy to engage with journalists. And of course, he was the spokesperson of the ANC, and the ANC, as a liberation movement, goes through its own internal struggles and its own internal challenges. But a communicator like Jackson will be able to say to the media, this is the position of the ANC. And the position of the ANC at times is not your position as a communicator. But all of you, you'll know, we relate to you, and we'll go off the record, we'll go in the background, we'll explain to you why that decision is the decision that has been taken. Because the ANC is a very dynamic movement.
Yeah.
It's a movement that gets, there is contestation within the ANC. So Comrade Jackson was able to navigate all that. I grew up with Jackson. When he came from the Eastern Transvaal, persecuted there, he stayed in Johannesburg in Alex when he worked there for the SACC, and he was always that person, a person that you can enjoy his presence at all given time. So journalists were able to relate to Comrade Jackson despite the difficulties. I don't know of one journalist that will have complained to me or talked to me and said, he smashed the phone in my ear or he got angry with me. He wasn't that person. He was a very, very honest person. Yeah. Let's remember him as a communicator of note. It is not going to be easy for us to find a person like Jackson. Yeah. He was a dominating figure in the ANC communications. And in fact, why I'm saying I'm devastated is because just the other day, our communication strategy group that we have of the Tool House, he sends a message saying that, thanks for the support, thanks for you giving my family all the support. I'm off the oxygen now. I'm just recovering in the hospital. So we're all hopeful that Comrade Jackson will pull through. And unfortunately, it wasn't to be. But I think he was that frontliner that must lead in smashing this enemy called the coronavirus. We need to fight it and defeat it.
Yeah, and true to form, as Nkenke Kekana reflects there, Sbu and Troy here in studio with me. He was very honest about the time that he contracted this deadly disease, the coronavirus, and he tweeted it. So, true to form, he was honest about his own personal troubles as well, Sbu. And this had to do with him quitting alcohol, for example. We'd remember that he had been arrested at one point for drunk driving, and very honest about that. He was honest about the troubled times that he had within his family. He had a child. He went on radio. I remember I listened to him on radio where he spoke about his son who was having difficulty with drug addiction. And then, the biggest of all, in my view, the loss of his daughter. Talk to us, Sbu, about whether this is what endeared him to so many of us in the media space.
I think you've captured it correctly, Goli, because Jackson had gone through a lot of personal tragedy. And I think what distinguished him from other politicians is that there was not this normal facade that you see with other politicians where they either act tough or you just cannot get through the mask. I mean, with Jackson allowed himself, as you're saying, to be vulnerable. And the thing about him is that he was relatable, he was also personable. Yeah. He could talk about his own issues. And I remember after that arrest, there was that embarrassing moment where he was singing from inside the cell in Cape Town after his arrest. and he actually came out and talked about his alcohol addiction and his trouble with alcohol. And I think even at a time when he quit alcohol, he was able to talk about that. And I think in understanding him, you also have to understand the difficulty that most politicians, and particularly those who are coming from the former liberation movement, the relationship, the broken families where they are not there, they are out on the streets fighting apartheid, and where there's always this feeling and this sense of guilt that he had not been there for his family. And I mean, I think that is what is a common thread, mostly with most freedom fighters. I mean, the same thing with Nelson Mandela. I mean, his children will talk about that, the fact that they've never had a father. Even at the time when he was out of prison, he was always putting politics first, always country duty first. So that becomes the underlining factor, and also and I think what also distinguished Jackson was the fact that he was able to laugh about it. He was able to humble himself and say, I'm sorry. He would apologize, and I can count the number of times that he's had to apologize.
Troy Martens, you would have had an opportunity to work at Luthuli House as a communicator over and above working as a government communicator. Sbu relates a very interesting point, and it's about Jackson Mthembu and the children and him being a freedom fighter, perhaps a moment of guilt that would visit him at times. Was that the justification, by the way, Troy, for why he made this a difficult commute? Because I can only think of it as a difficult commute between Johannesburg and Mpumalanga, Johannesburg, as he was the spokesperson of the African National Congress.
So, yes, I mean, I've worked with a lot of politicians over the years, and I can honestly say that they are the hardest working people I know. I think they get a very bad rep often, and I'm not saying that in any form to defend them, but there isn't a politician I know that is at home on weekends. They're out there with the people, whether it be campaigning or having community engagement events and so on and so forth, or whether it's attending political meetings. I mean, we hear of the NEC meeting, which happens, once every so often. But in between those meetings, there's other meetings. Then there's the caucus meetings, and then there's parliamentary duties. So it's. I really do feel that, I mean, a lot of politicians have opened up in private circles about that struggle, about the fact that they struggle to create that balance, and many of them have children that have been raised by other people, and it's a sacrifice that you make. And at the end of the day, he was an ANC comrade in the epitome of what it should be. He really did go forth and give his heart and his soul and his everything to the position and to the organization, and that comes with personal sacrifices, unfortunately.
Troy Martens, let me thank you for your time, and let me thank you all. Mahlatse, I feel very guilty because time is always an enemy when you're having a good conversation. I can't have you give us a last point there. It would have been nice to ask you how it is that we can remember Jackson Mthembu, especially at a time like this, with this battle of COVID-19 or against COVID-19. But I'm sad, Mahlatse. I'm sorry as well for not being able to come to you. But thank you for your time. Mr. Nkenke, Kekana, thank you very much for your reflections, sir, and deepest condolences to you, the comrades of Jackson Mthembu, and indeed those that he served with in government. Sbu Ngalwa, yours and mine are to basically work here. So I'm not going to thank you. You're doing your duties. Thank you very much, Sbu.